Okay, we're recording.
Okay, good evening, all, and welcome to the meeting of the Ad Hoc Ethics Code Review Committee of February 11th, 2021. Is there a motion to formally open the meeting?
I make a motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, aye or signify.
Aye.
Meeting is formally open. Thank you. Review and approval of the minutes of the meeting on February 4th, 2021. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
Well, you still had a question in there and I didn't know what the answer was. There was like a partial sentence hanging.
Yeah. So let's get it out. Let's have let me rephrase that. Is there a motion to discuss the minutes of February 4th, 2011?
I'll make a motion to discuss the minutes.
And is there a second?
A second.
Okay, so I did have a question which I put forward regarding Brian. Do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I do. So the Zoom thing, I just write whatever appears on their Zoom ID under attendees and participants. So like we have 2 attendees, Robert Stark and Vita 4. So I just write that. And then with the like partial sentence, I'm so sorry about that. I saw that. It was pretty much the Board of Ethics saying like the person committed the conduct. So I guess they decided that the person committed the conduct. So
Well,
find it.
What I would say, and I appreciate your effort to be faithful to the video. What I would say is if you encounter that, then you can either reference that there was something that was incomplete and refer the reader to the actual recorded minutes, or just delete it. The best record, I think, is, as Mike pointed out last week, the best record is going to be the actual recording of the meeting.
Yeah, I
So-
have it. Sorry, I have it. It said I should change it to, he stated that the Board of Ethics could decide that the person committed the conduct and was in violation of the code of that ethics. So I think that was my mistake. I was just like typing so fast. Sometimes I like miss words.
Okay,
But when it's unclear, I'll refer them to the video.
okay. So how can we change that to make the minutes complete?
I mean, I could do it after the meeting when I send the final version.
All right,
to
so you can
everyone.
make that change.
Yeah, just add
All
2
right.
words. Yeah.
Are there any other comments regarding the minutes of February 4th? If there are not, is there a motion to approve those minutes subject to that correction?
I make a motion to approve.
Second,
Second.
any discussion on that motion? If not, all in favor, please signify. Aye or raise hand. Any opposed? Those minutes are approved. Thank you, Brian. And Brian, I'm going to ask you as to speak up if during your participation in the meeting, I have a little trouble hearing you.
All right. Sorry. Thank you.
No worries. Okay. The status of mailing the letter, our ad hoc committee letter to employees of the Village of Mamaroneck. I take it, Nora, if you're with us, I take it that
Yeah,
Okay.
I asked for it to be put on Monday's meeting, but we had an overfull agenda and it didn't get on. We had a very long executive session, so we didn't really get through our work session. So I asked that it be put on for the 22nd.
okay.
And I have every faith that it will be.
And we'll push it to the forefront on the 22nd.
Excellent. Thank you.
Can we just confirm who it went to, the letter? Because it did go out, but not to all employees, right?
We think it went to the union presidents only.
Okay,
I don't know if it went to the union presidents. At this point, I wouldn't myself accept that leap. I read it as just the email went out asking the union to submit questioning. My hope, while we have the mayor and trustee Lucas again, is that this is, expedited. And, my opinion is that the development of this policy as it pertains to, ethics and ethics rules has to have some input from the workforce. I just hope that they at least have the opportunity to provide input.
I agree. And I think that will be what I
There's an email from John. He'll be on momentarily. Okay. Before we move to the next agenda item, two brief comments. One, I followed up on the suggestion made by Mark Ettinger last week that the Code of Ethics include a provision that punishes false statements made to the Ethics Board. Such a provision does not appear in the model code promulgated by the state of New York, nor does it appear in the model code written by Mark Davies in the volume on municipal ethics. That is just my observation. It certainly is something we can take up when we get back to the section by section review of the code, but I wanted to bring that to your attention.
Dan, I also took a look at our surrounding municipalities. It doesn't appear there either.
Okay, that's very
Dan,
helpful.
Dan, are we still waiting to go to the mayor for John to jump in?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Are we waiting for John before we jump into the mayor?
No. No,
Okay,
John's going
'cause
to join.
I was going to discuss it. Just while it's fresh on my mind, and I apologize, no one's over later, but I am concerned that we put any of these provisions in, at least on the initial. I don't want to do anything that suppresses the advancement of information to the Board of Ethics, right? And so when we put these things in here, people might feel fearful as to come forward, right? And I think that the goal here is to get information flowing. Now, there might come a point in a process where we might want somebody to certify, say, before a hearing, but I would be concerned about anything that would cause somebody to say, I don't want to report this. I'm afraid. So I hear what you're saying, but I believe as much information as the board can get, and then they can act on it, and that's they're charged with doing, right? They separate what is useful, what's not. I wouldn't want to suppress anything before it gets to them.
Mhm. Okay, well, we will take these issues up in detail as we go back to our section by section review. The second matter I wanted to bring your attention, a little advance notice. I would like to change the March 4th meeting. I have a conflict that evening. We have plenty of time ahead of us. Well, we have 3 weeks ahead of us. So if you could look at your calendars for that week and just, I'll remind you and ask you for some alternative days on that week. It's just for that date. Okay, I would like to go forward and,
Can I just say one thing about that? March.
yes, and speak up, please.
Okay, it's March 1st and March 3rd. We have budget work sessions from 5 to 7, just so you know. So I'll be in the budget work session, so I could do it after that.
And I'll be in the sessions as well, Nora.
Right.
Okay,
So it'll be like 7:15 if you want to do it those nights. Okay.
okay. As I said, I'll send a reminder through and we can sort out an alternative date. Okay, I would like to move on to the next agenda item and honored and pleased to have with us the mayor of the village of Mamaroneck, Tom Murphy. Tom, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We welcome your contribution to the work of the committee and support of the committee. And the floor is yours. We welcome every and all observations and comments, suggestions you have.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to all of you for doing this important work. What I want to talk about is my experience having to be the hearing officer and the decider on the penalty phase of a determination that happened. You know, in the 126-year history of the village of Mamaroneck, we, as far as I know, had never had this situation come up. The lawyer who I was working with and who advised me could not find a comparable situation in New York state law. So we were kind of going by the seat of our pants, kind of, and making up the procedures as we thought fit, and to try and give as much due process to the person who was charged by the ethics board. But you know, I mean, probably more hours than almost anything that I've done as mayor went into that. Both reading the voluminous record over and over, talking with the attorney, running around in my mind. But what I want to talk about more than that is the procedure, right? You know, and I think it was a mistake, and I think that I'm partially to blame for it in the way we handled the hearing. The hearing was conducted almost like a public hearing for a law, right? Where everybody got their 5 minutes to say whatever they want. And that's not really what this was. As I've looked into, more and more, situations that were more in line with what happened, this is more like a disciplinary hearing. And as such, it should have been, and just to remind folks, I was not there to make a decision about whether the ethics board made the correct decision or an incorrect decision. My decision was solely whether or not the person who's charged should be removed from the position in the village. So it wasn't there to, almost like an appeals court. It was just about punishment, or the lack of, or what punishment. But really, my only options was to remove somebody or not to remove somebody. I didn't have an option of any other level of punishment. But so I don't know how many people actually came and testified and sent letters in, but I think what happened is that both sides, both the person who was charged and the ethics board, got unfairly maligned. Was the subject of ad hominem attacks. Was the subject in some cases of outlandish speculation about motives and stuff like that without any proof. There was only one person who testified under oath. And if I were to do it again, everybody would have had to have been under oath. I think it's very important that if you're doing something like this, it not turn politicized. This got politicized. And it got to a point where, it wasn't about the decision, right? It was about the case itself. And that really did a disservice both to the person who was charged and to the people who spent, hundreds of hours working on this, and who, gave a lot of time and effort, and who were appointed by the Board of Trustees, and who were given a task to do, and who did it to the best of their ability. I really believe that in the end of the day, the village would have been better served if there had been a professional hearing officer. So one of the things I want to talk to you about tonight is in the new law requiring that if this ever happens again, and the odds are 1 in 126 that it will probably never happen again. But if it does, I really think it's important to have a professional hearing officer, someone who does this day in and day out. And, Dan, I know that there are people who make their whole careers as arbitrators, as hearing officers, and they're usually, good lawyers who are able to boil down the facts and, not get involved emotionally. I think having elected officials do this was a really bad idea. I think having all 5 trustees do it would have been catastrophic. It would have been nothing but political theater. I really did try to do my level best to be objective and to be fair and to consider all sides. And, in making my decision, I took into account the service that the charged individual had given to the village over decades and decades. And, because I think a lot of times in life, you have to look at the totality of contributions and not just one incident. But I do believe that the open-ended, anybody gets to say anything, when they really don't have anything relevant to say about actually what happened or the facts of the matter, when they didn't sit there for hours and hours and hours and listen to testimony, I give a lot of latitude to the person who was charged to pretty much present her whole defense that she presented to the court. And in retrospect, I probably went too far in that latitude, because I also didn't, if I was going to do that, then I should have allowed the ethics board to have, a rebuttal. But, it's 2020 hindsight. And I'll be frank, there's nothing in my life that prepared me for doing that. I think I had, very good counsel, but he had never done it before. And, we had to deal with, frankly, political pressure on all sides. This was a very traumatic thing for the community. A lot of us, had relationships and friendships that were hurt by this. And, that doesn't take away that whether it should have or shouldn't have happened. But, it would have been better to have someone without a connection to the community who does this on a professional basis to, make that judgment about whether it rose to the level of removal. While I'm, talking about the difficulty in the hearing, I am very comfortable with the decision I made. I labored long and hard over it. And I think if I had to make the decision again, I would make the decision again. But it could have went either way. And, I tried to not let the drama of what was going on sway me. And hopefully I didn't. But, it's difficult to ask an elected official to do that. The Board of Trustees wants to change the law to allow the whole board to make that decision, which I think they should. I'm fine with them being a final arbiter, but I don't think they should be the hearing officers as a group, like a 5-member hearing panel. That would just be unwieldy, and it would last forever. And just imagine if someone makes an objection, all 5 members would have to vote on the objection. A good lawyer could tie you up forever. And I've seen that happen in this community. In another instance, when they had police hearings years ago. So that really is my concern, and the person who might next hold this hearing or a hearing like this might not have been born yet. But I think part of being an elected official is, looking out for your community in the future. And I would hope that when you propose the law, you propose that hearings for removal be handled by, Dan, I know that you can get up the wording, maybe the American Arbitration Association, or someone who has experience in disciplinary hearings.
Mhm.
And that's really what I came here to say tonight.
So Tom, it's Ellen. Can I ask you a question?
Sure, Ellen.
Where do you, or how do you differentiate between code of ethics, that's to me is discussing in general terms what's appropriate behavior versus not, versus a process or a procedure? So what should be in the code? Because to me, that's the behavioral
Yeah.
side.
Yeah, I think that you can have in the code that if it becomes necessary, if the Board of Ethics makes a determination that a member of an appointed or a land use board, or whatever it is, has had behavior that amounts that rises to the level of dismissal and removal from the board, then the village should hire a professional hearing officer to hear the case and make recommendations to the village board. That's the
Mayor,
procedure.
would you then say that if it doesn't rise to the level of dismissal, that the board should handle it or the mayor should handle it? It would almost seem if your path is, that there's a lot here, why wouldn't it be any discipline should be turned over to a hearing officer?
Well, because what's going on right now is that, listen, and this doesn't count, of course, for civil service and the police, because they have their own disciplinary structure, right? So this really is about appointed people, because the law in New York State currently says that it's the mayor's responsibility to remove members after a public hearing. That's all the law says. It doesn't give any guidance to how to do the hearing. It doesn't give any, other, enlightenment. That's all it says. So if the voters decide to give that responsibility to the Board of Trustees, they can still have that responsibility. But if the local code says, yes, that's the Board of Trustees' responsibility, or it's the mayor's responsibility, however that shakes out. But in the village of Mamaroneck, the hearing is performed by a hearing officer. Because
Yeah,
there's no other discipline, Mike, that has to be arbitrated under our code by an elected official, other than removal of land use board members. The ethics board right now can fine somebody, and that doesn't go to the village board. That's not in our purview. The only thing that's in the purview of an elected official right now is if there is a request to remove somebody. So that's the difference.
Any other questions or comments?
I just want to go over 4 things while we're all, hearing the mayor's here, but Mayor, I was writing some notes down, and there were 4 things that I took from this that I just want to, clarify, is that you talked about the only option was for discipline was to remove or don't remove. You talked about testimony under oath is important. I just would ask, Dan, or maybe this is something for council, but whoever weighs this, should they place greater weight on sworn testimony versus unsworn testimony? The need for a professional hearing officer. And then, Mayor, you spoke earlier in the initial part here, and I just didn't understand, was about everyone who was allowed to comment. Was it your suggestion that not everybody in the public should be allowed to comment on this? Should that be limited or not? Because I didn't catch that.
But yeah, I think that, comments upon this, it just got into, it didn't get into specifics. Usually in a hearing, you're giving evidence, right? In a disciplinary hearing, in almost any, realm that you look at, it's all sworn testimony. In a public hearing, when you're passing a law, right? Anybody can get up and make a comment, and that's fine. But that wasn't what this was. And because there was such wide latitude, people took advantage of that to, say unkind things both ways. And it did move the ball forward. None of that, had an effect on whether there should be removal or not. It really, if you care so much about it and you have information that could change whether or not someone got removed, to just say, I've always liked this person, you shouldn't remove her, that really, then it gets all into, the political, right? Of who likes who and who doesn't like who. I want to take this out of the political and have it done more professionally. And, I think that it hasn't been done a lot because I think, looking back on it, elected officials don't want to do it. Elected officials, don't want to go through it. And I can understand that because it's, it was harrowing and it was, no one signs up for this, when you run for a trustee or mayor, right? No one ever told me, that you're going to have to do this. And like I said, I'm fine with the decision I made, and I did the best of my ability, and I really do believe that. But I also think that it got very politicized. I think that it got very divisive, more divisive, and that had to do with the Board of Trustees and the mayor being involved. And at the end of the day, if there was an impartial outside arbiter who doesn't know all the players and have long time relationships on both sides of this, it would have been more professionally done and cleaner.
Tom, would you propose that the decision of a hearing officer be final or reviewable by the mayor or the Board of Trustees?
Reviewable.
What does that mean, though, Tom? Reviewable.
What it means is that,
Does it just not bring us back to the same point we are when somebody is making
no,
a decision?
I don't think so, Michael, because you then have a basis for the final determination. You can still either remove or not remove, but if it's done professionally, if it's done in a manner that is viewed as even-handed and as objective, I think people are going to be more happy with the end result.
I take it.
And don't get me wrong, I did my best to be even-handed and objective.
I
But
take it then.
I'm an elected official, and it's hard to remove that. I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I take it then that the decision that would be reviewable would be one that, if it were the mayor, the mayor could review the record, but it would not be a forum in which there would be hearing of any kind. Presumably, I mean, you can't prevent anyone from, well, I'm taking you through the procedure now. The arbitrator makes a decision. Would the arbitrator's decision then be public before it was either affirmed or reversed or modified by the mayor?
I would think it would have to be. I think that in the interest of fairness, it would have to be, and in the interest of, I see no reason under open meetings law to keep that secret.
So the arbitrators would issue an opinion,
Yes,
or hearing officer, and that opinion would be made public, and then it goes, let's say, to the mayor for, the mayor either affirms, reverses, or modifies. And then during an interim period, or between the time the arbitrator's decision is made public and the mayor makes the mayor's decision, presumably then the public could weigh in. But you would not be, if I assume you would not be advocating any kind of a public forum. You obviously couldn't prevent anybody from writing and saying, I
no,
disagree with the hearing officer's opinion, or I agree with the hearing officer's opinion.
no, you can't stop people from doing that. But it's, at least there's a firmer basis in law and procedure. But just let me clarify, you can't modify. What the law says is you remove, you don't remove. So it's not even like you can say, I can fine you, right? Because you don't have that option under the law.
So it's either you affirm or you reverse.
Correct.
My take is I understand the point of wanting a hearing officer, but I think you end up with the potential of being in an uncomfortable situation later on yet again. And if you have the entire board make the ruling, it allows for that responsibility to be the entire board of trustees.
Well, if that law passes, the entire board will make the ruling, and I don't really have that strong of an opinion on that. My real problem is if the entire board had to be the hearing officers and had to sit as a board of 5 as hearing officers. I refer you back to the police hearings that were televised in 2003, when 5 trustees were the hearing officers, and they couldn't get through, the first, beginnings of the hearing because the lawyer just tied them up procedurally too much. And every time there was a procedural question, they had to stop, confer with their lawyer, and take a vote. And that lawyer at the time was very adept, and he knew what he was doing. And you don't have 5, judges. 5 judges don't hold the trial, right? I mean, you can appeal to 5 judges, but 5 judges don't hold the trial. So somebody's got to, be that person who directs the hearing. And all I'm saying is that I think the hearing should be based, on fact and people that have substantial evidence, and not just on, I feel this way, and, without having anything to, substantive that happened that about that you're testifying to.
But-
So I feel that, but I also feel like 5 people trying to be a hearing officer will just be a disaster. So
Mayor,
that's why I wanted to have some sort of professional hearing officer.
Mayor, 2 separate things there, just in terms of the hearing officer being one person and not 5 board members. And then the other thing I'm hearing is the weighing of evidence, right? And so would you propose that the public not be allowed to comment?
You know what, Mike, they should be allowed to testify. And there's a difference between testifying and commenting. And, if I'm proposing a law about, curbside pickup, then everybody's entitled to comment, right? But if I'm making a determination, on somebody's being removed or not removed based upon a substantive record that was developed, then they should be willing to raise their hand and swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth and testify about their knowledge or their,
I do, I understand your
I'm not
point you're
finished.
trying to
I'm
make.
not
and I-
finished. I'm not finished. They should be able to testify about, some direct knowledge that they have or, some way that, that there was a procedural problem that was not dealt with. I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
I understand your point, and on some level I agree, but I, that point can be taken a little bit further in the testimony or the commentary that we heard from the ethics board was, we, in a number of cases, it is not clear how issues were initiated. And it sort of leaves people at it makes people, it puts people in an awkward spot when they're trying to counter an argument that is an ambiguous argument with an ambiguous accuser. So, to a certain degree, if you're going to do what you are suggesting, shouldn't you also suggest that any filing or any request or any investigation be, by sworn testimony as well?
I have no problem with that, but that's not what I'm here to talk about.
No, I'm just curious because procedurally, the initiation of an investigation should also sort of be procedurally sound and
Well, yeah, but I think, John, I think we were on the board together, and when this was proposed, and the idea was to give people comfort with coming forward who wouldn't have come forward. That's what, we accepted and what was proposed. Maybe we don't like how that worked out, but the idea was that people would, employees or contractors or people who had business with the village who saw something, who felt that if they came out publicly, then they wouldn't ever get work with the village or, they'd be somehow harmed or damaged. I think a lot of laws like this have whistleblower protections and anonymity. The police arrest people based upon anonymous tips all the time. But if the evidence after the tip, doesn't pan out, then there's not an arrest made, right? So, and you might never know.
I think your leap is a little large there because, the arrest is made on an anonymous tip. Now, whether they end up getting charged or anything else happens is based on whether or not the anonymous tip was valid.
Well, the investigation is made on an anonymous tip. The arrest is made after the investigation. So that's kind of what happened here. Well, I don't know what happened. I don't know where they got their, information, but once again, but this is, down the wrong road. I'm really just here to talk about what was in front of me. And what was in front of me was a decision that I had no ability to alter. The question in front of me was whether to remove or not remove. The decision was standing no matter what I did.
Mayor, could I add just one thing? So then you would recommend that there be a wider range of discipline that you could have imposed?
Well, Mike, no, because the Board of Ethics has a wider range of discipline that it can impose. The only reason I was there
Is for,
is that New York state law
I got it.
was very specific that the removal of a land use board member was the responsibility of the mayor. We were advised this by our village attorney. Then the Board of Trustees decided to hire another attorney who gave us exactly the same opinion. And, so I would not want elected officials to be in the position of meting out punishment. you know, on a situation like that. I thought that that was good that the ethics board had latitude in our current code, and I would leave that there. But, you know, there's, you know, if the ethics board, you know, let's just say for an argument's sake, fines somebody $1,000, you know, then that person has, you know, a redress to go to court and have that overturned, right? That's an Article 78 on that.
But I'm confused. I thought the law says there has to be a public hearing, correct?
The law says there has to be a hearing.
I think it's a public hearing, and then there's a removal situation, which I think you were the hearing officer for the removal situation, which I think are separate things. So there has to be a public
No.
hearing.
No.
And then the removal.
No. I was the hearing officer for the public, and it says a hearing, after a hearing. It doesn't say public hearing, it says after a hearing. I'm sure of that. We made it a public hearing, and I'm glad it was a public hearing. I didn't want to do anything behind closed doors. And so it was my responsibility to hold the hearing and to decide whether to remove him, which we did. Listen, all I'm here to get across tonight was that this is not a good situation. And if the law is changed where the 5 members of the Board of Trustees are going to be the final determinant, that would be, you know, take that aside. You know, the voters will decide that. So whatever happens there, happens there. But in my view, holding a hearing with 5 people would be a dog's dinner. You know, it would just be a mess. And it would tie up the board for days and days and days. So consequently, it'll never happen. That's my main message here.
Any other questions of Tom on this issue? Tom, we have had many discussions as we deliberate this code, where we have talked about shifting certain responsibilities. And I'd like to get, as long as we have you here, I'd certainly like to get your view on it. One proposal is to transfer the training and education function of village employees from the Board of Ethics or the Ethics Board to the village manager. One reason being that it is burdensome to impose on a volunteer board the responsibility to develop educational materials and then distribute them or educate the workforce. The thinking is that give it to the manager to whom the employees report. You have a view on that?
Just, you know, a quick impression is that I think that might be a useful exercise, because we now have an HR department, which the village didn't have when this law was first passed. And I think that would be something that would be handled well by our HR department. So without making, you know, an ironclad promise, because I haven't thought it through all the way, I could see that working out. And I understand the limitations of volunteerism. And I know how much time everybody's putting in to these boards and commissions. And so, yes, I think that would be my first impression is, yes, it would be a good idea. But, you know, obviously I'd like to think about it more to see if there are other ramifications.
Of course, we're not holding you to it. We just would like to get your off the top of your head reaction because we
My
have.
first reaction is good.
Okay. What about the discretion of the ethics board to retain independent counsel when, if and when the ethics board perceives that the village attorney may be put in the uncomfortable position of advising both a village committee and the ethics board on the same issue? I may not have articulated that as well as
No,
I.
you did. I understand it completely. I think that, once again, my first impression is that the ethics board has and should have people on it that are familiar with the law. So let's just put that on one side. But when they need counsel, it would probably be better to have someone who's not affiliated with the village. But, you know, obviously that comes with an expense, right?
Right.
Yeah. But my impression would be, yes, that would be an improvement. Under our current code, at the time when this was passed, we had an attorney who worked for the village as an employee. And yeah, in general, yes, but obviously the devil's in the details, but in general, yes.
Have you, in your experience, observed any matters that involve the Board of Ethics where political party affiliation interfered with the business of the board? There are provisions in the code which require, I think it's no more than 2 members of the board belonging to the same political party. Has that?
You asked me if the political affiliations of the members of the ethics board?
Yes, the ethics board.
I haven't seen that. But as I pointed out before, I felt this whole matter tended to get politicized.
Right.
No, but I think the question, Dan, if I could, was, do you have a perspective on whether the board needs to be balanced by parties? That's what, I don't think it's no more than 2, because then there could only be 4 on the board, correct?
No, it's supposed to be 2 Republican, 2 Democrat, 1 independent.
I'm sorry, I don't think that's right.
Yeah, it's not.
I think when you say political party, someone can be an independent and not be any party, and then you can have all 5 be independents because they're not affiliated, they're not in a party.
Well, it probably says no more than 2 Republicans, no more than 2 Democrats, because I know
Mention specific party affiliation.
It
What?
just says no more than 2 in the same party.
So
Okay.
if you're an independent, you're not in any party.
So
So it could be
what we have done is, as long as I've been on the board, is, tried to appoint, when a Republican left, we got another Republican. When a Democratic left, we got another Democrat. That's, I think, since its inception, the makeup has been 2-2-1. So in practicality, that's how it worked out.
Well, in this case, I guess it could be 5 independents, Brian, right? That's what
Yeah,
you're saying as well.
exactly.
Like,
Yeah,
it could be 5 independents. But
yeah, it could be. That's never happened.
have some type of balance is what it sounds like, if they're not all independents.
Well, I think when this was passed, I don't know, what the heck was it? 08 or 09, I forget. In the past 15, 20 years, the demographics have changed in the community and the political registration has changed greatly. When I first ran for office in 2001, I think Democrats had just barely had a plurality. And then over the past, 20 years, the Democratic total has just grown rapidly in the village of Mamaroneck. So I think the idea at the time was, the boards would be going back and forth, and we would try and keep it. We would try and keep the political parties evenly distributed. But what might be an idea, now that I'm sitting here talking about it, is try and ask for people of different experiences and not just different parties. Maybe a person with experience as an elected official, maybe a person experienced as a lawyer, maybe a person experienced as a contractor. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there.
Right.
Maybe the time where it just gets divided by political parties is, that's no longer a yardstick that we need to use.
But that is a yardstick in the New York Model Code.
Okay.
And our surrounding municipalities also do that.
Yeah. Might be time to change. What happens when we can't find Republicans?
I mean, then I
So-
guess. you just
Sorry,
get-
Mike.
Then I guess you just get independence, I guess. And I also think like getting a contractor, getting a lawyer, doesn't that limit like just lay people from the Board of Ethics too? Because I think lay people have like knowledge and experience to share as well. And instead of like limiting like, oh, one should be a lawyer, one should be this, I think it should be more open-ended. I mean,
Yeah,
it depends how you word it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Brian. I'm not wedded to anything. I was just, I was trying to get away from the political construct.
All right, something to consider.
There has been a lot of discussion during our meetings about who files disclosure statements, who's responsible for seeing to it that disclosure statements are filed, reputed or reported delays or omissions in filing disclosure statements. Do you have any views on that, Tom? Have you observed is there any controversy on the board? Is there anything that's come to your attention that you think calls for some change or more attention to this?
Well, when I was first mayor, there were a lot of people that were lagging behind. And, so it was brought to my attention and I called a few of them just because, I didn't want it to grow into something, something bigger, right? So I just called people just to remind them, come on, get this in, please, so we don't have to visit this again. And I think it wasn't done out of evasion or out of malicious intent. I think people are just really busy. And, they get a form from the village and it goes into the pile of mail and, you get to it when you get to it. Then you forget it and then the pile grows bigger. I mean, I've had it happen to me, not about that issue, but about other things, and then you're like, oh, geez, I was supposed to do this 2 months ago. And then you're hurrying to do it. So I think it's frustrating for the ethics board because they have, days where they, say, okay, we're going to look at everybody's form on said date and people don't have it in and then they have to go chasing people. But yeah, I don't know how to remedy that because it's just, I don't think anybody who I ever talked to or heard about was doing it because they were trying to evade a question or not fill it out. It was just a matter of, a lot of people are busy. A lot of people have 2 jobs and, they're taking the kids to soccer and they just didn't get to it. So maybe it's something that we could also send people that they can do online. We're doing paper copies that have to be notarized. So not only do you have to fill out a paper copy, then you have to go to a notary. And it's mean, I understand the reason behind that, because we want it to be a truthful disclosure and to have there be some, you know, sworn testimony, almost like this is the truth of what I, you know, my involvements and what I do. But, you know, there might be a way to do that, you know, with a link, you know, not notarizing, but, you know, just have people submit the information. And, you know, because, you know, it's a difficult thing to do, especially in a time of COVID. You know, you got to run around and find a notary.
We have had, or there has been discussion in the committee about imposing in effect, a penalty of suspension from office or failure to file after a certain date, curable by compliance. What's your reaction to that?
I guess my reaction to that is, if we're going to do that, then we have to make it easy for people to file. And then if they don't file, then I could say, all right, you know, you had ample opportunity to do this. That would be more, you know, it's hard, you know, you get somebody and you put them on the traffic commission, and, you know, especially these days on Zoom, you know, and, you know, they're a parent and you could hear the kids in the background, and, you know, they're trying to, you know, focus on what's going on, but, you know, this kid needs to go to bed, do a homework help. And it's just, I guess I don't want to be too onerous on our volunteers, but I understand the need for the disclosure. Maybe, you know, there are less boards that have to disclose, you know what I mean? I don't know. Does the rec department need to disclose everything? I don't know. You know, I could see land use and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we're talking about decision-making committees where
Yeah, I
they
guess.
can appropriate
They
money.
could- Yeah.
But Tom, the who is up to the board currently.
Well,
So
no,
you
but
guys could
eventually it's
certainly,
all up to the board, right?
No, but
Eventually it's-
the current code of ethics states that the Board of Trustees reviews the who has to do this on an annual basis. So if you all think the list is too long, you could change that.
I truthfully, I didn't see that, and as long as I've been on the board, we've never done that. But that's something to think about.
Or I mean, when I was on the traffic commission, I remember we just make recommendations, like we don't actually set policy, and I had to disclose things, and I know other committees who like make recommendations too that didn't have to disclose. So I think it should be clear who should disclose,
Yeah.
or at least it should be consistent and fair, who should disclose and who should not. I don't mind disclosing. I mean, I thought it was
Yeah.
fine. It's just when you have other committees not doing the same thing,
Right.
it
I
gets.
think the original intention was that it was, as Dan said, people who handle money, people who make decisions on, you know, that are what are considered quasi judicial boards, like the land use boards, were the ones that were required to disclose a little bit more because they had more, you know, they were the deciders, including the Board of Trustees. Whereas boards that are advisory should not be in a position where they have to fill out the entire financial disclosure.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Like the flood committee, even the arts council. But the arts council has a small budget, but
But can the Arts Council spend the money without?
I think, yes, you know, they get a budget for like shows, and they can hire bands and stuff like that.
They don't have to follow Jerry's procurement policies?
No, you know, they're not going over that limit. You know,
All right.
there's not going to be any bands this year anyway, as far as I know.
I just want to say, because I'm the Arts Council liaison, they typically don't go over the limit, but when they do for like a contract for all of the sound provision, they follow procurement. So they do.
All right,
At that limit, they absolutely follow procurement. Thanks.
Okay. We are at the hour. Are there any other questions for the mayor? If not, is there any, Tom, I think we've concluded our, your participation. You are invited and encouraged to stay for the next couple of minutes that will be in session. Thank you very, very much for your participation this evening. It's extremely helpful to us. Very, very helpful.
Thank you all for doing this. I'm going to take my leave. Thank you all for what you're doing, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Tom.
Take care.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor.
Is there any additional business to discuss this evening?
No, but I do want to just as a sideline comment. I think I may have frozen again.
No,
You're up.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I've mentioned while we were talking about distributing the code of ethics and making sure people have read them, the tool the village uses to monitor. So in September, we all got a class that we had to take on sexual harassment. There, last week, we got a chasing email. So it took them from September till February to follow up with people who hadn't done it. So I think we need to be very clear on timelines in the code.
Any other comments on that? Any additional business for this evening?
And just one thing, and I just want to go over, because I think while we're here, if we can just go over each night when somebody comes before us, and the things I picked from Tom, the most important thing, he's talking about the hearing officer replacing the mayor in that role, and then a final determination or maybe an overview by the board. Did anybody hear that different? Because I just want to make sure that we're hearing the same thing while it's fresh in our minds.
That's what I heard as well.
Yeah.
That's what I heard. Yep.
And then like the other things that I heard, although he wasn't making that point, I think he's important because he is a real case scenario as part of the process here. So I consider the input that he's providing, significant because he's the most recent person. The option for discipline or, is remove or don't remove. I don't know what we can do with that. But he
I think that's the state law.
Yeah, it might be, but I don't know. If
No,
we can
I looked it up
different.
while we were on here. It's state law. It's recusal, removal or not removal is the only decision.
I just bring it up so as we go forward, at least
Yeah.
we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
And then the testimony under oath versus not under oath. I believe that a hearing officer can place varying weight of validity or evidence on that evidence, right? So I don't know how we go forward, but he mentioned that a few times. And I think that we should at least consider it because he came forward and he mentioned that a number of times. And then, we talked about the professional hearing officer. For me, I've mentioned this a number of times. I think some of this goes beyond the point that a volunteer or even the board can do it. I've sat on a number of hearing boards, right? Where we determine discipline, determine fate. It takes a lot and you have to understand it. So maybe if we can in the future, talk about that and see, is that something that we want to just adjust or recommend for them?
And another thing to think about is, a professional hearing officer only for removal or a professional hearing officer for other issues. At what point, where do we go with that idea?
Right. And I didn't want to bring that up when Tom was on the phone because he said, well, other cases we're just recommending fines. And those are some of the changes we've discussed. Do we want to make it a suspension or whatever? So to your point, what else goes before hearing officer?
I don't know, but I mean, that's something we need to think about, but you have to keep in mind, as Mike has said numerous times in the past, this affects really the land use primarily the land use boards and the non-unionized employees.
John, if I can just clarify, I think it affects everybody in the village, right?
Yep.
No, right, right. But I
The
mean,
unionized employees might have other remedies available to them to assist them, but I think it includes everybody. Just generally, I am of the mindset that there should be outside assistance from a hearing officer, right? To everybody in the process. You know, since the start, I think that this is a lot of work, both on the board as well as the Board of Ethics, right? It might get to the point where it's just too much for a volunteer or for the Board of Trustees to take on.
So
but I mean, I think at what point do we, you know, is a hearing officer involved in every issue? Is a hearing officer only involved at a certain level? Or does the Board of Ethics make a determination to get the hearing officer involved? You know, I mean, those are all questions we would need to recommend or at least raise to the Board of Trustees so that they can think about it.
Yep.
Yeah, very good point. I certainly felt Tom's pain talking about the duty of conducting a hearing and making this decision. And I'll reserve my views for when we take this up, but I think that we absolutely should take it up, both from the point of view of what Tom mentioned and also with respect to whether there is a role for a hearing officer wherever there is a hearing called for. So, good points, well made. Any other matters for this evening? If not, we do not have a guest scheduled or an invitee scheduled for next week. So we'll go back, I think, to our section by section review of the code. We'll get to this issue certainly at the appropriate point. And we can take it up in any order that this committee wants to do so. I think working it through section by section is probably the most orderly way of doing it. With that in mind, is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
Second,
I second.
all in favor, signify, please.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful evening, a great week, and we'll meet again next week. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you again.
Bye.